Hi, I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Hi, everyone. Today I'm speaking with Angela Starrett. Angela is an award-winning investigative journalist. She's an author, an educator, and a podcast host. Her new podcast is called Land Back. It's fantastic, and so is our conversation. Boy, we cover it all today. I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Angela. It's great to see you.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to this because I've been listening to your new podcast, Land Back, and we're definitely talking about that podcast today. But before we get into, what Land Back means, and you putting together this podcast, for people that don't know who you are or they're not familiar with your work, you're a journalist. You're an author now. Your book is coming out in May. You're an educator. You teach. You're many things. You're a mom. How do you describe who you are or what you do to people when they ask?
Yeah, I think that's so important. In our culture and Gigsan culture, it's really important to identify where you come from and acknowledge that lineage, right? And so I think it's important for me to talk about that, but also talk about that I'm settler. I'm actually mostly white. So on my dad's side, I'm Gigsan, and my grandfather, Walter Starrett, was groomed to be the hereditary chief of Wigach, which is our house group, which means House of the Big Wings. And he turned down that role. It's a lot of people don't realize in order to be a Samogiet or the head of your house, it's a lot of work and it's a lot of money. It's a huge responsibility. So he said no to that. And so his brother, so my great uncle Neil Starrett, took that role and was Wigach for many years before he passed on a couple of years ago at the age of, I think, 109. So we have those good genes, but and lots of time on the land. That's what I attribute that to, is running up and down the trap line and spending time on the river and just really being, absorbed by the land. But so my dad is Charles Starrett. And they're Lakibu, so Wolf Clan. I don't have a clan because it needs to be through your mother. So I do have a Gigsan name. It's Lualia Zumbists, which actually means woman on TV and radio, or talks in a box. And then my mom was white. So I think that's really important for me as a white person to acknowledge that, yes, I'm reconnecting with those roots, that it's English and Irish, and we came from a place called the Isles of Jersey. But more importantly to me is to recognize that because of the skin color, because of how I was raised, I have a lot of privilege and I have a lot of power. And I think that's why it's really important for me as someone who understands, what it's like to be an Indigenous person, what it's like to experience racism, by recognizing that my cousins experience that who are darker skinned, seeing them being kicked out of places just for being Indigenous, and then recognizing that I have power and I have privilege and the ability to use my voice and not experience per se the type of harm that they may. So those two identities are really important for me to discuss when I'm speaking anywhere.
I find that fascinating because, let me ask you this: Have you experienced racism in your life?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting because my son looks Indigenous, I think a lot more than me. And I remember him being little and I was like, are we being floor walked right now because of my son, who was like 4 or something at the time? And then, I don't know, it's kind of weird because I remember my dad being like, the older you get, the more, I won't say what he said, but Indigenous you're going to look. And And I remember I was going to a ceremony in Lummi actually, and it was during Trump. It was like 2017 or something. And I walked into the store and it was just like everyone stopped and looked at me. And this one man started screaming, "Make America white again." And then I was just like, what is happening? And I stood in the line and I was like, this is weird. And I was like, what is this about? And everyone was just like really agitated and looking at me. And I was kind of like, huh, what? And then I was at actually a native gas station. So it was like the community owned the gas station. And I forget why we got into it, but she was like, "Oh no, you look native, girl. Like it's probably the earrings," and I was like, weird. But I experienced a lot of racism. I mean, as somebody who is very vocal about being Indigenous on Twitter, I've been told, go get scalped, trigger warning, go get scalped, go become a missing and murdered Indigenous women. Lots of like sexualizing my indigeneity as well. Like horrific hate mail that I've had to go to the RCMP about. And then from colleagues too, just a lot of misunderstanding, like, what's your spirit animal? Or are you an Indian princess? Or let's go for a powwow, Ange, and things that might seem normal to Canadians, but that are inappropriate to say to an Indigenous person or inappropriate to say at all. Saying that I've only gotten awards because I'm Indigenous, things like that. And always having the work that I do scrutinized by the public. And knowing that as a person that even, isn't full Indigenous, isn't even half Indigenous, still has to work 5 to 10 times harder than any other person in any other industry that I work in. And so absolutely, I don't experience it as much as people who, for example, are living in community, are darker, and have more institutional barriers. But for sure, I've faced racism and hatred.
I never really have thought about whether somebody is, full Indigenous or half Indigenous or a quarter Indigenous. I've never really thought about it like that. And so I find it interesting. I find this part of our conversation interesting because why do you think that's important to mention besides for your own personal reasons, right? Like because we're also in a time now where we're finding out that people who have said they're Indigenous and have benefited from saying that they are Indigenous or have Indigenous heritage. And now we're finding out they don't have any Indigenous hereditary ties at all. And we're seeing awards being taken away. We're seeing, all kinds of things happen. Again, this is something that is so foreign to me because I just don't understand why somebody would lie about that. I've just branched off into two totally separate things. So, but the fact that now from Indigenous people, do you find that they see you as more white, or do they see you as more, or is that
no? I mean, nobody.
You know what I mean?
Nobody does, I don't think, and I feel like it's really important for me. So, for example, I went to this conference the other day, and this white woman got on stage, and I'm like 99.9% sure she was white, but she never said that. She never self-located. So for us as Indigenous people, self-location is so important. And then she just kind of went on and on about this cultural stuff and positioned herself as sort of like the cultural caretaker of this knowledge and kind of led people on to believe she was Indigenous. And for sure she was not. And I just think that's so important to say, like, I am white and I'm doing this good work and it's amazing. And I'm so grateful that I've learned all of this. Like, just say it. And I'm always the only one who acknowledges the white side of me and acknowledges my power and privilege. and makes a vow, makes a commitment to do something with that. I never see people get up on stage and say, I'm white or I'm settler. And I think we need to do that more. There's this like vast sense of white fragility that I'm seeing, and it's quite scary and alarming. And it's like, at one time it was like powerful to say we're white, like you'd get through the door. I never, in university, in jobs, I never ticked that box, Indigenous, because I felt like it was going to work against me. And it did. And then you'd also hear from people, oh, you just got this or you got that because you're Indigenous. I always made sure that I had straight A's. I always made sure I had the highest grade point average. I always made sure that I was working 10 times harder than anybody else to get where I am. And so, yeah, it's really important for me to acknowledge that settler piece because we do have power in this society, very much so. We very much so live in and I'm not saying that we're all white supremacists, but we live in a society where if you're white, you have power, very much so, around tables, as children in schools. It's just the sad place that we live in today, where you have people who are Indigenous who are still not seeing equity in funding, in treatment, in jobs, in fairness of all senses. And that's the same as in many cases, Black people, and how many Black and Indigenous people do you have in your workspaces? How many Black and Indigenous people are holding powerful positions in this society? And today I'm seeing this thing where I'm hearing a lot of, in particular, white men saying, I will never get a job as a CEO because I am white. That's not happening. That's just not happening.
I know.
But it's like, wow, like that's scary. And so that's why I say that I'm mostly white, because I want people to say, I'm white and I can understand. I can get there too. Like Angela's got all this knowledge and, I can be that person too. I can be that ally. I don't need to take up space. I don't need to be racist. Like I can Google around and learn myself as well. So that's kind of why that's really important for me to situate my identity in that sense.
Mm-hmm. I think you just taught us all something very important with this part of the conversation. It's something that for sure I haven't talked about on this podcast before with the many, interviews that we've done over the last few years. So I appreciate that because it's definitely a perspective that hasn't been brought here before. When in your journalism, in your career as a journalist, you work for CBC. You've done this podcast called Land Back. But, I follow you on Twitter. I follow you on Instagram. I'm a big fan of your work and your voice. A lot of people really started to pay attention. I say a lot of people. Some of us were always paying attention to you. But when you broke the story about the Indigenous grandfather and his 12-year-old granddaughter who were handcuffed outside of a bank in Vancouver because of their help me out with the words here, their card, their
status card.
Their status card. Thank you. I could not find the word. That story went viral, that story. I mean, the image of a grandfather and his granddaughter in handcuffs they did nothing wrong. And can you walk me through what that was like for you, just as a human being having to tell this story?
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting trajectory of a conversation because when I was in that gas station, actually, and that guy was saying, make America white again, I actually went to Lummi, the reserve there, to visit some friends, and we did a solstice ceremony. And we did a feeding of the fire ceremony, which was very powerful. And I was kind of like not really sure what I was going to do in my career. I was just kind of just not sure. The racism and stuff like that was really getting to me. And I was getting exhausted. And I just did a ceremony. And one of the people there said, Have you heard about that Maxwell Johnson who was like arrested? And I was like, no. And they told me the story about how he was arrested with his 12-year-old granddaughter for opening up a bank account. And I was like, of course, shocked. And then I was like, oh, there must be more to this story, like, clearly. And so I went home, and it was over Christmas. And so I started making calls, and it was like kind of shocking actually that the VPD and BMO were like, yeah, this happened immediately. And so that was verified. Yeah, it was really interesting. It was interesting um, that it took, I guess, BMO for one so long to admit wrong, but also to see how swiftly that they acted in trying to like put together an advisory board and get some answers. And there did seem to be some movement and came to the community, which I was there as well. And BMO came and were walked around the fire, and, they had to show their faces and try to work forward on a plan moving forward to correct. You can't correct the wrongs of the past, but you can try to blaze a new trail together. And so I feel like they tried. And then it was interesting with the VPD just saying, oh, no, nothing was done here wrong. The officers were diverse. There was no systemic racism. And to see that attitude continue to today, even though there's been opportunities presented in the big house, an opportunity to do right. And that was very sacred to be there, was like a month ago now when the VPD were invited back into the big house for the officers to apologize. And I should say too, BMO didn't bring the tellers forward or the manager. They didn't do that either, right? It's just a bit weird, and people are like, oh, an Indigenous culture. And it's like, well, if I punched you in the face, right? And then I said, oh, like, my husband's going to say sorry to you. I'm not available. Like, that would be unacceptable. And so we just live in this time where I feel like it's so constant reminders of what it's like to be an Indigenous or Black person in the society. And he wasn't the only one. When I did research, there were Black, and actually I think there was a South Asian man as well who were arrested for trying to deposit a check. It's just reminders of the unequal society that we live in, and opportunities presented by these institutions who have a long history of colonial violence against Indigenous people and continue to this day, but are unwilling, despite all the opportunities presented to them to learn and to heal, are rejecting that. And so it's hard when, Indigenous people are out there working so hard to provide an opportunity for a new path forward, but then the people on the other side are unwilling to accept the truth. So I always tell people, like, you can't do reconciliation without just the truth. The truth is very basic. It's what we teach our kids, like, don't lie, be honest, be truthful, like very fundamental things. And when you have like entire institutions where their culture is unwilling to face that truth, like we're just never going to get there. So that story taught me a lot about, I guess, disappointment and hopelessness, right? And helplessness. Like, as a journalist, you can tell the truth, but that's all you can kind of do, right? And you can just hope that changes will be made.
Yeah, it taught me that it taught me about saying sorry. It just taught me about the word sorry, really more than anything. And I think about it often because, we talk about restorative justice. And in schools now, this is what they're teaching, right? They're teaching restorative justice to students. So if you are in school and you push a kid and the kid falls down and hurts their knee, instead of that kid who did the pushing getting suspended for 3 days, they now bring those kids together to talk and to hear about how much that hurt and what that meant when they pushed them. And for the other child, this restorative thing. And it was happening with one of my kids who had something happen at school at the time when these police officers were supposed to be going to the big house. And when it didn't happen, and the school was pushing this restorative justice on me with my kid who had been hurt. And I sat in the meeting and I said, how can we teach our kids this way when the leaders in our community, the so-called leaders in our community, can't even say sorry? They can't even go to a ceremony it wasn't to humiliate them. It wasn't to, uh, you know, uh, you know, it just prolong the process. This was part of the healing. And for some reason, it's really hard for people to just say sorry.
Yeah, and that's like so interesting that you brought that up because I was talking to a friend of mine who did a talk about mistakes. And I was like, oh, like owning up to mistakes is so important to me just as an individual. And I actually really like it. Like, even like it sucks. But even just if I'm doing something petty, I'll just be like, oh my God, I'm just going to let you know this was my thought process. And I just feel like I should tell you. But also being mindful of like, is this for me or is this for the person? But in the podcast, actually, in episode 3, I made a huge mistake. And it's me. I'm the journalist who's always touting being ethical and trauma informed and decolonial. And I did try to get it right, but I kind of like the journalist in me was like, well, this is fine. Like, this is what we do all the time. And I was called out, and someone said, you didn't talk to all the survivors. Yeah, you tried to get a hold of me, but you never did, and you didn't try hard enough. And so in episode 3 of the podcast, I say, I made this mistake, and I'm actually just not going to air this piece of the podcast because I think it's really important that that this be done right and that the survivors have a voice here. And I think as journalists, we hold a lot of power, and we often feel like it's just our job and it's just in our codes to be the one in charge, be the one controlling the narrative, not ever offering collaboration because that could be considered bias, not allowing people to cancel the story, not telling people they can cancel the story, never giving them control. And what does that mean when you're combining or looking at that through a trauma-informed lens? It's like the exact opposite. When someone's in trauma, especially like new trauma and PTSD, their lack of control is super, super heightened because in many ways they're living from their fight or flight mode, which you have no control over. It's a bodily function to help, not a bodily function, but it's a part of our body that keeps us safe, right? And you don't have any control when you're in that state. So for a journalist just to say, for one, you don't need to go through all these horrific details. I can find those in the parole documents or wherever. And also, you don't need to tell me all of this stuff. You can stop when you want. You can tell me what you want. This story can be about how amazing your language is. We don't need to focus on the trauma. Like, that is at odds with journalism. Being trauma informed is at odds with our standards of journalism. And so I fought with myself a lot in episode 3, like, well, we won't get sued and it'll be fine. And like, this is how we do things. And then to go back and be like, what this woman is telling me is what I'm telling people in my newsroom all the time, that they need to listen to survivors' voices, that they need to be trauma informed, that they need to put their ego aside. And so it sucked. I was just like, oh, this really sucks. But maybe it can teach people too that we're not always right as journalists. And it's okay to admit a mistake and say, I'm just not going to play this. And that's huge, right?
Yeah.
To like cancel a piece of tape, it's like a huge no-no. And I just said, I'm going to listen to Indigenous people. If we're indigenizing this podcast, if we're decolonizing this podcast, this is what we do. And it was really hard. It was hard to admit that. But on the part about indigenizing, it was also really hard to fight for the ability to have an Indigenous lens and to make sure all the names were said correctly, to know that sometimes I had to go talk to 5 elders. Like, it took way more time than any other podcast, and to do a cultural fact check, to let some of the participants in the podcast listen to the podcast before it aired to make sure we got it right. And there were a lot of things that we missed that were super inside baseball cultural that were very tricky to navigate. And so, yeah, admitting wrongs, I think, is a part of human evolution and development. And I feel like I'm watching a lot of people, like going back to the white fragility, just be like, can you just not evolve like just a little bit, like just open up a little bit because it's good for you too, right? I wouldn't want to die like just standing on a hill, when I'm 35 and never surpassing that place.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to admit you've made a mistake, and it's hard to say you're sorry. But I got to tell you, when you do it, the next time it's easier. And then the next time after that, it's easier. And we would be a different society if we could admit our mistakes and we could say we're sorry. I mean, we really, truly would be a different society. I do want to talk about the podcast. Before we do that, I just want to mention that we always thank our guests for being here. And by doing that, we ask them to choose a Canadian nonprofit. You chose the Boys and Girls Club. They help kids and teens develop the skills they need to succeed through programs, community-based services, and relationships with peers and caring adults. I think everybody knows the Boys and Girls Club. They're fantastic. And we will be giving them $500 to thank you for being here. So on your behalf, we're giving them $500. So thank you for choosing them. So Land Back, I'll just start this part of the conversation by saying it is unbelievably good. This podcast is impossible to stop listening to. It's so beautifully done, Angela. Like I am there. I am hearing the footsteps in the snow. I know how cold it is. You're telling me what they're wearing, what's on their, how their hair is. I am there. Like
That's awesome.
It's so good. What does Land Back mean?
I mean, I think in the podcast, you can kind of hear me struggle a bit with that, where at the beginning, I'm like, Land Back is, returning land that was stolen from Indigenous people from, the state, from the colonial governments, from the federal government today, in some cases from the church and state. From the church, sorry, I already said state, but from the church and how they went hand in hand with the state at the time. I'm just thinking about when I say that, does that even make sense to people? I'll give you an example. There were a bunch of totem poles that were taken from a Gitxsan village and sold to museums, and then that money was used to build churches while residential school was going on. So this was a huge part of colonization. And those totem poles are explicating our lineage, our connection to each other, the stories that brought us here today and how we became. And so they're deeply intricated or deeply connected to the land. And as I went along, I realized, well, Land Back means something really different to every different person. And I think my purpose of the podcast was I'm so tired of the 101 with people. And thank goodness I'm really seeing some shifts. This year, I've seen some big shifts where it's like, oh, thank goodness people know like the 101 stuff. Like, what is a reserve? We don't pay taxes. Yes, we do pay taxes. What is a status card? You have to say Aboriginal or Indigenous, like all of that kind of stuff. So podcast was a chance for me to go deep into some of these really important issues. And one of them was like about Land Back. So people might just be like, oh, it's just giving the land back and that's it. Every person I talked to had a different understanding of what that meant. So one of my elders, Ardith Wilson Dimdigi Boo, said it's not give us the land back. Our land is already ours. We don't have to prove in court that this is our land, that this is our territory. We've already done that through these court cases. What we need to be saying is get back. Leave us alone. Stop taking our land. Stop green lighting these resource extraction projects. And I always smile when I say that because my family and many Gitxsan families are huge logging families. And so resource extraction sustainably was a huge part of my family's life and Gitxsan's life too, but just done in a very different way and having to do with consent. And then going to, in Vancouver and talking about Sanok and talking to the elders in the Squamish elders and talking about their land and them saying, me crossing the Burrard Bridge as a little girl and looking down and having my dad say, this is all Squamish land. And one day we will all be back here again. And what does it mean when you've been colonized by people that haven't been nice, that have burned your homes down, that have barged you across the ocean, and now you're living amongst them and building a high rise to help people with things like housing, but also sustain yourself for many generations. What does it mean to be part of this economy and seeing people benefit from intergenerational wealth? And this has been your land since time immemorial, and you've just seen very, very, very minute slivers of that land. So the benefits from that land. So just seeing what it means to different people was really powerful. And that's what I love about being a journalist is I'll go in with everyone has an opinion, we're not robots. So going in and being like, this is what I think it is. And then asking a lot of questions. I love asking questions and seeing things from a sphere, right? And you see all these different sides. And I know there was an Indigenous proverb I heard once that there's not two sides of the truth. There's many different sides of the truth. And those help to build an understanding. And I think my work as a journalist and through this podcast, I'm hoping that people see that there's many different versions of the truth. And, you hear Gordon Price, who says, Indigenous people building a high rise isn't an Indigenous way of being. That's his truth. That's what he believes. And then you have me asking, well, we're Indigenous people. Should we just be, out there picking clams and in tunics? And when everybody else is living in this world-class city, do we not deserve to benefit from the same, from the land in the same way that you do? So it's ever evolving my understanding of what land back is. And this is just a podcast based on land in BC. When you go out east, there's a whole other point of view when it comes to treaties. And we mostly have modern treaties. We don't have the numbered treaties aside from the Douglas treaties here in British Columbia. We mostly have the modern day treaties and comprehensive claims. But when you go out east, there's a whole different side of land back to explore when it comes to the treaties, the numbered treaties out there. So yeah, I hope people, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, you touched on it there, I always say, there's three sides to the truth. Your side, my side, and the truth, right? So, same as what you just said. Listening, it was the back and forth, the Gold Commander, if we can just talk about the Gold Commander for a minute, because when you are telling, when you're giving us this information in this podcast, and also injecting some of your own personality into it, which is what I appreciate, right? The Gold Commander. Yes, that's really what he's called. But yeah. Find out in episode 2. So the Gold Commander is part of the RCMP. And you also talk to who are policing land defenders who are defending their lands. And as we've seen on the news, what we've seen, we know that there's a lot of violence. I mean, it's quite terrifying at times to listen to and definitely to watch. And before we go, Angela, just tell me, okay, so your book comes out at the end of May 30th. It is called Unbroken, My Fight for Survival, Hope, and Justice for Indigenous Women and Girls. I feel like I've watched you write this book, even though I haven't seen any words. I've watched you write it on social media, knowing that you've been writing this book. Are you excited for it to finally go out into the world?
Yeah. I feel like timing is everything. And some things happened this year, which were really, really incredibly negative. But I'm learning now about radical acceptance. And sometimes things happen for a reason, and just learning to accept things even when they're really negative, to just take the lesson out of it. But everything sort of shifted. My book was delayed by several months. but I feel ready. I always tell people when you're writing about your own trauma, you have to be ready. You have to have support. I have so many beautiful, amazing people in my life, men and women that are just so healthy and so on this path of healing and calming our nervous systems and collective consciousness and being a bit of a hippie,
Yes.
but I don't care.
I love it.
Feels great. And I also just wanted to say, I remember being on the bus when I first moved to Vancouver and seeing you on the buses. And I don't know why, but I was always a fan of you. And I was never a big news person ever, but I'd see you on the bus. And then I remember when you went from, I forget what it was, but it was more featurey kind of stuff.
I did the weather.
The weather, yeah.
Yeah.
And then I remember when you went into news, and I just remember being that's really cool. You can shift in your career in different ways like this. And I just remember being so inspired by you seeing that. I was like, this is really cool. And so
you
I
are
feel
so kind.
Yeah, when you wanted me to be on your podcast, I was like, oh my God.
Oh my gosh. Well, I feel the exact same way about you. I'm in awe of your tenacity and your honesty and your vulnerability, really. And I can hear it in this podcast that you do. And I really believe, Angela, that this podcast, if every Canadian listened to Land Back, they would move forward with a very different perspective of how things really, truly are. You have some beautiful voices in this podcast, including yours, and you are one hell of a storyteller. So please don't ever stop telling the stories. Please, please, please don't ever stop, because you are so good. I love following you on Twitter. You are at Angela Sterrett on Twitter. You are also on Instagram, and you have a website, which is angelasterrett.com. Thank you so much for your time here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thanks for your voice too and everything you do. And I'm glad as female journalists, we're pushing the envelope and not being afraid to speak out, despite what's in front of us. So thank you. From my heart.
Thanks for listening to another episode of TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for another conversation. You can also check out our website, telus.com/podcast, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at TELUS Talks.